The courtroom was supposed to be a temple of solemnity, a place where truth stood taller than ego. Yet in that charged chamber, filled with marble echoes and restless anticipation, it was laughter that first shattered the silence. Judge Stephen Breyer, a man once revered as a measured voice of American justice, leaned back in his chair, lips curling into something halfway between a smirk and a scoff, before a laugh spilled out, low at first, then unmistakable. It wasn't the laugh of amusement. It was the laugh of dismissal. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken. For anyone else, that laugh might have been disarming, a signal to shrink, to accept their place beneath the weight of authority. But for Crockett, the sound only carved the silence sharper, the moment heavier. The entire chamber felt it, journalists pausing their pens, attorneys shifting in their seats, even the cameras seemed to lean closer. The laugh lingered longer than it should have, reverberating like a dare. And when it finally faded, the space it left behind was almost unbearable. It was as though Breyer had declared victory without ever lifting a gavel, as though the power of his chuckle was enough to seal the outcome. But Jasmine Crockett's silence told a different story. Behind her stillness lay years of being underestimated, of being told her voice didn't belong in rooms like this. That laugh was familiar, it was the sound of every barrier she had already broken, every door she had forced open when the powerful tried to slam it shut. Breyer leaned forward, convinced his authority had already cut her down. His eyes sparkled with the arrogance of a man who had been unchallenged for far too long. But there was something he didn't see, something the audience watching both in the chamber and across the nation would soon never forget. Because Jasmine Crockett was about to answer. And when she did, her words would pierce the room like ice, freezing every smirk, every whisper, every ounce of arrogance in its tracks. The laugh had filled the chamber with arrogance. Her next line would fill it with silence. The exchange unfolding in that courtroom was bigger than two people. It wasn't just a judge mocking a congresswoman, it was a reflection of something older, deeper, and painfully familiar in America. The laugh carried more weight than amusement, it carried centuries of dismissal. The subtle but sharp message behind it: you don't belong here. You don't measure up. This space is not yours. For those watching at home, it wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about every person who had ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to leave the room because they didn't fit someone else's idea of power. The stakes weren't just legal or political, they were cultural, generational, personal. Breyer, with his decades of judicial authority, represented the old guard, the gatekeepers who believed experience alone granted superiority, who wore arrogance as a robe of protection. Crockett, on the other hand, embodied something new, the rising voice of communities long pushed aside, the unflinching confidence of someone who knew silence was no longer an option. And that was exactly why the cameras were there. The nation wasn't tuning in for a dry courtroom debate. They were tuning in because, beneath the legal arguments, this was a battle over dignity. It was about whether laughter could still silence the voices of those who dared to challenge power. The stakes rose with every passing second. Reporters whispered that this moment would dominate headlines no matter the outcome. Commentators texted producers, preparing to flood the airwaves with hot takes. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with awareness that something bigger than procedure was unfolding. For Breyer, the laugh was a tactic, an attempt to assert dominance with the casual flick of superiority. For Crockett, it was a line in the sand. Her response would not only define the moment but ripple outward, shaping how millions of people understood the balance between arrogance and resilience. And for the people watching, the anticipation was unbearable. They leaned closer to screens, waiting to see if the familiar story would play out again, the powerful ridiculing the challenger shrinking under the weight of it. But Jasmine Crockett was not about to shrink. What Breyer thought was a show of dominance was actually a spark, and the fire it would ignite was about to engulf the room. Stephen Breyer's name carried weight. For decades, he was a pillar of America's judiciary, cloaked in reverence and institutional respect. His decisions shaped precedent, his words dissected in law schools, his image polished by the press as that of a wise elder statesman. But reputation has two sides, And behind the marble bust of respectability lurked something colder, an arrogance refined over years of unchecked authority. He had earned the right, many believed, to laugh at anyone who dared cross him. After all, hadn't he outlasted presidents, weathered scandals, and sat at the apex of the judicial branch? But that confidence, that unshakable belief in his own superiority, had slowly curdled into condescension. There were whispers, of course. Former clerks who remembered the smirks, the dismissals, the way Breyer could silence dissent not with reason but with ridicule. A chuckle here, a raised eyebrow there, it was enough to cut younger voices down to size. It wasn't rage, it wasn't open hostility. It was worse, the quiet certainty that he was untouchable. And in moments like this, that certainty became theater. Breyer's laugh in the courtroom wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the product of decades of dominance, of watching others defer, of knowing he could undermine opponents with the smallest gesture. To him, Jasmine Crockett wasn't a threat, she was an interruption. Yet arrogance blinds even the sharpest minds. Breyer didn't see how the world had changed around him. He didn't see how the laughter that once cemented his authority now exposed his weakness. In an America reshaped by activism, by identity, by the voices of underestimated rising louder than ever, his laugh was no longer an exclamation point of superiority. It was a relic, a fossilized response that told onlookers exactly how out of touch he had become. The tragedy of arrogance is that it always writes its own downfall. Breyer, comfortable in the armor of prestige, believed this moment would play out like so many others. He would laugh, the challenger would falter, and the chamber would quietly return to order. But what he couldn't grasp was that Crockett wasn't like those before her. She wasn't intimidated by laughter, she was fueled by it. And while Breyer saw himself as the unshakable judge, history would remember him differently. Not as the man who silenced dissent, but as the man whose arrogance gave rise to one of the most unforgettable courtroom moments in modern politics. Because Breyer's laugh wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of his unraveling. Jasmine Crockett's journey began far from the polished floors of a courtroom dominated by marble and tradition. She was born into a world where voices like hers weren't just ignored, they were actively suppressed. From the start, she carried the weight of expectations and the sting of underestimation. Teachers questioned her potential, colleagues underestimated her grit, critics doubted her place. Yet through every dismissal, she learned something crucial: silence was never safety, it was surrender. Her path through law school wasn't paved with privilege or shortcuts. It was forged with long nights, relentless study, and a determination sharpened by every slight she endured. Where others coasted on networks of influence, she had to carve her space, clawing past dismissive professors and condescending peers. Each obstacle became another layer of steel, shaping not just her skills but her resolve. And when she stepped into public service, those dismissals followed her. They mocked her background, questioned her credentials, doubted her authority. But what they never understood was that every insult added fuel. Every laugh she heard was a rehearsal for the day she would finally stand eye to eye with someone like Breyer. Crockett didn't build her reputation on arrogance or inherited privilege. She built it on advocacy, on standing beside those who lacked the microphone, the platform, the power. Her voice wasn't meant to echo the chambers of the elite, it was forged to rise above them. So when Breyer laughed, Crockett didn't just hear one man's arrogance. She heard every time someone had told her she didn't belong. Every sneer in law school, every headline dismissing her as unseasoned, every smirk from colleagues who thought her presence was an accident of politics. And instead of shrinking, she rose. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but Crockett wasn't simply defending herself in that moment. She was carrying with her the weight of every person who had ever been mocked, every community that had ever been told they weren't enough. Her reply wouldn't just be her own, it would be theirs. And Breyer, sitting in his fortress of arrogance, had no idea he had just awakened the one opponent uniquely prepared to dismantle him. Piece by piece, the air in the courtroom tightened as if the very walls had leaned forward to listen. The faint scratch of pens halted, the shuffle of feet froze, and the cameras locked onto Jasmine Crockett. Judge Stephen Breyer's laugh still echoed faintly in the minds of those present, but the moment of silence that followed was deafening. Crockett shifted in her chair, slow and deliberate, the calm before a storm. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, not raised, but laced with steel. "Respect, Judge, isn't given because of the title on your desk," she began, each word slicing the quiet. "It's earned by the way you treat those who stand before you." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, rippling outward. Breyer blinked, caught momentarily off guard. He had expected protest, maybe even outrage, but not composure, not precision. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Congresswoman, this chamber operates under rules, not emotions. You do well to remember that." His tone dripped with condescension, each syllable designed to reassert control. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned in just enough to close the gap, her voice unshaken. "And you do well to remember that rules mean nothing when applied without fairness. A laugh might belittle me, but it cannot erase the truth." The clash was no longer subtle. It was direct, fire meeting fire. Gasps escaped from a few in the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing history in the making. What began as a dismissive chuckle was now a full-blown confrontation that carried the weight of principle versus arrogance. Breyer's laugh had been his opening move, but now he felt the sting of a counterattack. He raised his voice slightly, trying to reclaim authority. "You presume to lecture me on fairness? Do you know how many years I've served this court, how many precedents I've upheld?" The chamber braced for her response, and Crockett delivered with precision. "Years don't excuse arrogance. Precedent doesn't excuse disrespect. And laughter doesn't excuse injustice." The words struck like hammer blows. Breyer's jaw tightened. For the first time, he seemed less in control. His composure faltered, not visibly to all, but to those watching closely, the shift was clear. The debate escalated beyond individuals. Breyer stood for the insulated power of institutions, Crockett stood for accountability, for the voice that refused to be silenced. Each statement, each retort, amplified the stakes. Breyer leaned back again, masking unease with a smirk. "Strong words, Congresswoman. But passion does not change the facts." Crockett's reply was instant, sharp, "Neither does arrogance." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in energy. It was the kind of moment that television networks replay endlessly, the kind of exchange etched into memory. The escalation was no longer a courtroom exchange. It was a national confrontation. And while Breyer sought to drown her in tradition and authority, Crockett weaponized the very things he dismissed: clarity, dignity, truth. The more he laughed, the colder her responses became. The debate had escalated into a duel, one where the laugh that once symbolized dominance now revealed weakness. Every confrontation has a fulcrum, the exact second when momentum shifts, when the balance of power tilts. For Jasmine Crockett, that moment arrived not with raised voices, but with silence. Breyer had attempted to corner her with technicalities, citing cases, rattling off precedents like weapons from a well-stocked arsenal. His words carried weight, but his tone betrayed him. Every citation felt less like law and more like a shield. Then Crockett leaned forward, her voice low but unwavering. "Judge Breyer, I respect the law. But what I will not respect is its use as a curtain to hide arrogance. The people watching today don't care how many Latin phrases you recite. They care about fairness. And fairness begins with respect." A hush fell. For the first time, Breyer had no immediate retort. His arsenal of legal jargon suddenly felt flimsy, insufficient against the moral clarity she wielded. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the subtle shift, Breyer's smirk faltering, his fingers tightening around the armrest. Crockett, by contrast, appeared taller, steadier, the embodiment of calm resolve. The turning point was undeniable. The room that once tilted in Breyer's favor now leaned toward Crockett. Even those who doubted her presence began to see her. This wasn't just about one exchange anymore. It was about narrative. Breyer was fighting to maintain the illusion of superiority, Crockett was fighting to expose the truth behind the illusion. And in that moment, the illusion cracked. The power dynamic shifted. Crockett had seized control of the courtroom, not by shouting, not by breaking decorum, but by holding a mirror up to arrogance and letting it collapse under its own weight. The laugh that had begun this confrontation was no longer a weapon. It was a mistake. The climax of the exchange arrived with Crockett's final blow, words so sharp they cut through marble, words destined to echo far beyond the courtroom. Breyer attempted one last stand, raising his voice with a tinge of frustration. "Congresswoman, this chamber will not be turned into a stage for your performance." Crockett rose slowly from her seat. The simple act electrified the room. Standing tall, she locked eyes with him and delivered the line that would define the day. "No, Judge. This chamber is already a stage. And your laugh was the performance. I'm just here to remind America that arrogance has no place in justice." The words slammed into the room like a gavel strike. Reporters gasped, pens scratching frantically to capture them. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, lingering on Breyer's stunned expression. The judge, who had moments earlier dismissed her with laughter, now found himself frozen, stripped of the aura of superiority. His laugh had been reduced to a symbol of weakness, his authority dismantled not by volume but by truth. The chamber sat in stunned silence. Crockett's words hung in the air, crystalline and unshakable. They were the kind of words that history doesn't just remember, it replays, quotes, engraves. Breyer opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence was louder than anything he could have said. The man who once commanded rooms with laughter now stood muted, undone by the power of his own arrogance. The gavel finally struck, but its sound felt hollow. The debate was over, not because a judge said so, but because Jasmine Crockett had ended it with words that could not be undone. Breyer remained seated, his smirk gone, replaced by the solemn weight of defeat. Crockett, meanwhile, sat back down, her composure intact, her victory not shouted but etched into the silence that followed. Reporters flooded the hallway moments later, their headlines already writing themselves. Crockett freezes Breyer, courtroom silence after explosive exchange, the laugh that backfired. Social media exploded. Clips of the moment spread like wildfire, the hashtags #CrockettCold and #BreyerLaugh backlash trending within minutes. Millions who hadn't watched the hearing live now witnessed the unforgettable climax online. And through it all, Crockett remained steady. She didn't gloat, didn't bask in the attention. Her victory wasn't about headlines or hashtags, it was about principle. She had refused to be belittled. She had transformed laughter into silence. For Breyer, the damage was irreparable. His laugh, once a tool of dismissal, was now a symbol of arrogance undone. His legacy, once polished, now carried a scar that no gavel could erase. The resolution was clear: power may laugh, but truth endures. The hearing was adjourned, but the story was only beginning. Across America, people replayed the moment, not just as entertainment but as inspiration. It wasn't just about politics. It was about dignity. In homes, classrooms, workplaces, the debate sparked conversations. How many times had laughter been used to silence? How many voices had been dismissed, ridiculed, underestimated? And how many, like Jasmine Crockett, had the courage to answer with truth? That day in the courtroom was more than an exchange between a judge and a congresswoman. It was a mirror held up to the nation, forcing it to confront the arrogance of power and the resilience of those who refused to be belittled. Breyer's laugh began the story. Crockett's words ended it. And as America replayed her line, "Arrogance has no place in justice," it became clear, this wasn't the end of a hearing. It was the beginning of a movement. To everyone who has ever been laughed at, dismissed, underestimated, remember this moment. Stand tall. Speak clearly. And never let arrogance write the final line of your story. Because sometimes, one laugh can spark a silence that shakes a nation.